The polls don't close for another 10 minutes, and it may be a lot longer before the vote totals start coming into our newsroom. Earlier today, we talked with 4,800 voters as they left the polls. Political editor Mike Flannery is here now with details of some of what they told us.
Well, Don, the turbulent election contest called party loyalty into question for thousands of voters, but it really seems not to have changed things all that much. Some 72% of today's voters called themselves Democrats, 18% gave no party affiliation, and only 10% called themselves Republicans. But of course, Bernard Epton kept telling voters that casting one Republican ballot wouldn't hurt you that much. We'll see how well that pitch worked. When we asked voters exactly what pitch did work with them, what element was the most important thing in their decision, this is what they told us. 42% cited leadership ability. Honesty was cited next most frequently, and caring about neighborhoods was the next most frequent one after that. 16% of the voters said that the one debate between Epton and Harold Washington was the most important factor in their decision. Now, as for that debate, it was seen or listened to by 78% of today's voters, compared to 87% of primary voters who saw one of the pre-primary debates between Washington, Mayor Byrne, and Richard Daley. It looks like a large number of the Democratic precinct captains who worked for either Byrne or Daley sat this one out. Many of them were ordered to sit it out by white ward leaders who were asked by Harold Washington to keep vote totals down in their neighborhoods. In the primary election, 57% of all voters were contacted by precinct captains. Only 40% of today's voters said that they were called on by their precinct captain. You can see how that breaks down by race here. Volunteer contact was also down in this election. 44% in the primary, 31% today. That may be because a lot of voters had their minds made up in advance. Only 10% of all voters waited until the last few days to pick a candidate. 16% of whites waited, only 2% of blacks. 22% of all voters chose in the last few weeks. 33% of whites, only 9% of blacks. 63% of all voters had their minds made up long ago. 50% of whites did. Fully 87% of blacks did. Gentlemen?
We're not dealing with any numbers yet for two reasons. One, we're not getting anything very significant. Another reason is, of course, the polls haven't closed yet, and we don't want to be in a position of impacting on the election with these last 9 minutes to go. If we should say Harold Washington is winning big in some area, all the anti-Washington people will run out to make it up. But we do know some things, and let's discuss it frankly. You know, it's basically speculation.
We want to hold off while the polls are still open, but the folks that I've talked to, the precinct captains and some of the ward leaders in the black and white parts of town, are telling me that maybe the news isn't all that good for Bernard Epton, that big turnout along the lakefront, that there is a big turnout along the lakefront, and maybe some of the Harold Washington pitch to the white liberal conscience is paying off here in the last few days.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the Newspoll results on the decisions, and when they made their decision, I found kind of interesting. What it said to me was that a lot of white voters weren't lined up along racial lines the way some of the candidates were saying they were going to. In fact, a lot of white voters were having a hard time deciding where they were going to. Do we have an indication yet what parts of the city seem to be taking the longest and which way they were going?
Well, there seems to be, again, from the Board of Election Commissioners and from ward leaders themselves who have their captains out and their guys out in the precinct polling places, they say that in the black wards on the west side and the south side, there is an enormous turnout, a very large turnout. Black voter turnout lagged behind white voter turnout in the primary. It doesn't look like that's going to happen this time.
But at this point, Mike, is it difficult to tell how many Democrats are voting for Epton versus what they voted in the primary?
Well, we don't know, Harry. That is something that we're going to have to wait for those raw vote totals to see. But I'll tell you, you saw in these numbers we just showed you that the precinct captains in many parts of town were not working on this one. They were out golfing or doing their city jobs. Maybe the garbage will get picked up unlike it does in election week in the past. And I think that may have had a big impact and could end up helping Harold Washington in the white neighborhoods.
We'll see.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with John Coughlin in the 5-day forecast.